Here we have your standard XYZ coordinate triad. This should be familiar to you from SolidWorks. Just to orientate ourselves with the corresponding planes in SolidWorks, the XZ axes correspond to the top plane, the XY axes correspond to the front plane, and the YZ axes correspond to the right plane. By default, when bringing a model into PhotoView 360, the floor orientation was aligned with the XZ or top plane in SolidWorks. Depending on how you created your geometry in SolidWorks, the top plane or XZ axis plane may or may not be the correct floor orientation for your rendering. PhotoView 360 2010 adds up axis functionality, which allows the user to specifically define which axis is in the up position and therefore which plane the floor plane is aligned with. If we click the settings icon to bring up the settings palette, on the environment settings tab, you'll see the up axis area. We have 3 different choices and then a checkbox at the bottom. We happen to be in the Y up configuration now. It's highlighted in orange, and this is the default orientation a model would be loaded into PhotoView 360. If we switch to the X up orientation, you'll notice our triad spins to have the X axis in the up direction and therefore aligning the floor with the YZ axis or right plane from SolidWorks. If we choose the Z up option, you'll notice the Z axis is now facing up and the floor is orientated with the YX or front plane in SolidWorks. We'll switch back to the Y up configuration. And currently the Y-axis is in the positive direction pointing up, but in fact for our rendering purposes we may want the Y-axis to be facing in the negative position or down. We can flip this by choosing the flip axis checkbox, in which case the Y-axis is now actually pointing down instead of pointing up. So let's go back to the Y up orientation. There's one more thing I want to show you, and that's the ground height, or you could say floor height adjustment. Right now it's set to 0 millimeters, and what PhotoView 360 is doing is placing the floor at the bounding box of geometry. So if we zoom in on the letter Z, that is our lowest point of geometry in the Y up configuration, you'll notice the floor is just under that letter Z. You can tell by the shadowing there. That may be okay for our rendering purposes, but we also may want to change that floor height or that ground height to be something else. So in this case, we want to change it to be at the bottom of the letter X geometry. And we can do that by typing in a value for the ground height. And in this case, it's going to be 2.35 millimeters. And you can see the ground has now moved up to be placed right at the very base of our X geometry. If we go back to our Z and zoom in, you can see that we have the floor actually breaking into the geometry for that letter Z, and it's actually creating kind of an odd effect and an odd shadow. Probably something you wouldn't want to see in your rendering, but if you were focusing on an area where the Z wasn't seen and you needed to align your ground plane with other geometry, the ground height adjustment would allow you to achieve this.